Thank you so much, Jerry, for taking the time and coming on the show today. I really appreciate you doing that. Been looking forward to this conversation. You, from my perspective, are one of the, if not the leading kind of people in and around regulation as it relates to crypto, being executive director at the Coin Center, which is a DC-based think tank focused on public policy issues with Bitcoin and crypto at large. First and foremost, for those who aren't familiar, would love to kind of hear your story from as early as you're kind of willing to go, and then maybe we can segue into how you got into crypto in the first place.
Well, thank you for having me. How far back am I willing to go? I was born a small Cuban child in Miami in 1976. No, I'm kidding.
That's not too early if you want to start there.
No, so look, I've spent my whole career at the intersection of technology and regulation and law. But I started, I came to DC right after college to work at the Cato Institute. And I left Cato to go to George Mason to study law. And after that, I went to the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And in each of these places, my focus was always tech policy. And I always thought that I had kind of missed the most important part of tech policy, which was the crypto wars of the mid to late 90s, where the right to use encryption was sort of secured for everybody by the EFF and EPIC and others who fought that battle. And I thought I had missed all the most exciting parts of tech policy. But then in 2011, I on a podcast actually I heard about Bitcoin and started reading about it and just like everybody else fell down the rabbit hole. And so I started and at the time it was not very clear what the policy, or at least I should say, it was not very clear to Bitcoiners what the policy questions were going to be. Just that there would be some, and to me that was the most fascinating thing, was sort of the intersection of Bitcoin and all of the regulatory questions that would be raised by a completely decentralized way of storing and transmitting value. And so I started writing about that. When I was at Mercatus, I was running the technology policy program there, and started writing about it, speaking about it, asking folks around town in DC. They heard about Bitcoin, they hadn't, but I was very lucky to just be kind of right place, right time to sort of become the Bitcoin guy in DC, the guy you would call if you, were in policymaking, in or out of government. You had a question about Bitcoin, just by virtue of writing about it and speaking about it. I sort of became that person, and the rest is history. I did a lot of education of policymakers. In 2013, in the summer of 2013, HISGAC, the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee of the Senate, began to do an investigation of Bitcoin, and I helped sort of with that effort. And in October of 2013, I testified in the first congressional hearings about Bitcoin that HISGAC held. By that time and shortly thereafter, of course, there was a Mt. Gox implosion, then there was the Silk Road takedown. And by that time, I was spending, almost all my time at Mercatus working on Bitcoin-related regulatory issues. And it just sort of became apparent, and it became apparent to me and to others in the space, that there needed to be a full-time organization focused on this. And so we started Coin Center in 2014. And so we've been running for about just over 6 years now. Again, answering policymaker questions and trying to get them to adopt policies, to the extent that they have to adopt policies that allow for as much freedom of innovation as possible.
So winding it back a little bit to, you talked about how you had felt that you had missed kind of the prime opportunity or prime time to be involved on regulations around cryptography. And I'm not super familiar with like this era, but I guess in kind of the rise of the internet period of time, and then realized in the early 2010s, maybe 2011 more specifically, that cryptocurrency would be kind of the next frontier where this would be a huge deal and you could have a significant impact. What exactly about the 90s did you feel that was important that you had kind of missed out on? Like, why did you recognize the importance of those early battles before crypto as we kind of know it even emerged?
Oh my God. So the crypto wars, if you're not familiar with it, you should, I encourage you and all your listeners to just go type in crypto wars into Google and read. But basically, in the mid 90s, just as the internet, as you say, was becoming a more consumer thing, it was, encryption, what we now take for granted as a completely normal thing that we do every day when we connect to our bank account. The little lock shows SSL, or when we use Signal or even Apple Messages, we are doing end-to-end encryption. We take that for granted today, but that it was not clear that that was going to be an individual right in the early 90s. Encryption was a military technology, and it was something that, as it became used more and more by average people, the government wanted to, in particular, the military and the National Security Agency, wanted to try to prevent that. We want to try to keep that genie in the bottle, so that basically encryption would not be available to anybody outside of the military. And of course, that's kind of a fool's errand, because encryption, after all, is just math, and it's math that can be expressed in symbols, which is speech. And so it's going to be very hard to control that. But they tried, and they did things like, for one thing, encryption was classified as a munition, kind of the equivalent of a Stinger missile, right? And so if you wanted to export a munition, you have to get a license from the State Department. So if you want to, if you're an arms dealer and you want to sell, missiles to, the UK, let's say, you have to get a license from the State Department. Well, the same was true for encryption. If you were an MIT cryptographer who came up with a new encryption scheme and you wanted to post that on the internet, because by posting it on the internet, you are by necessity exporting it, you would have to get a license from the State Department, and that's how they would. And if you didn't, you were a felon. And this is what happened. I forget his first name, Zimmerman, who created PGP, Pretty Good Privacy. There was a grand jury convened to decide whether he should be prosecuted for violating munitions export rules, because he published PGP, which we take for granted today. But anyhow, there were a lot of folks who worked both in the courts, but also in Congress and elsewhere, to fight that battle to make sure that encryption. It was clear that encryption was basically speech rights, that encryption protected privacy rights and anonymity rights. And the good guys won that battle, right? We have encryption today, and it, quite frankly, it powers so much of the generative uses of the internet that wouldn't be possible without encryption. But anyhow, that was all not certain back in the mid-late 90s, actually early to mid-90s, and that was definitely a very important war that had to be fought.
So relating that to, modern day and what we're dealing with crypto being, relatively new still, and policies being relatively, not concrete as of yet, and still very much kind of in the process of countries, figuring it out. Where do you view along like regulatory lines, but even more broadly, like I think it's fair to say that there's a parallel between kind of where crypto is now and where the internet was at, pick your date, maybe sometime in the 90s or maybe early 2000s even. But where does that kind of comparison, if you think it's a fair one, how far does that kind of go and is accurate versus, where are the major differences in how, again, how you can kind of see regulatory elements unfolding versus just the industry at large still being by a lot of people's perspective, quite nascent still.
Yeah, so I do think it's an apt comparison, because it's technology that kind of does not fit with the model that the law was written for, right? So, um, you know, kind of both with crypto and with the early internet, laws are always written assuming that there was going to be an intermediary that could be regulated, or assuming that we could know, um, uh, in what jurisdiction a particular actor was in. So the laws were written with certain assumptions that when you add the internet, it just kind of makes those assumptions go away. And the same thing is true for crypto. And it takes a while for regulators and lawmakers to update the law to take that into account. And in some cases, there's no updating of the law that's possible to take it into account. It's just a new reality. Um, and so, there is the comparison is apt. I think we've come a very long way, though, since the first real government, um, uh, sort of action related to crypto was in March of 2013 when FinCEN issued its first guidance on what they call convertible virtual currency. Um, and since then, we've had agency after agency and jurisdiction after jurisdiction that's been basically confronted with questions of how the existing law applies to crypto. They have come forward and sort of said how they see it, at least given it a first pass. And in general, at this point, um, we have pretty good clarity and certainty about how the law treats crypto. There's some very important exceptions to that in the margins, but in general, we kind of know. I think it's because we're also at the early internet stage of the industry or of the technology and its effects on society. Um, we have yet to see some real effects that the technology will have on society that will no doubt cause lawmakers and policymakers to think about changing the law. But at the moment, there's a pretty good equilibrium. So we certainly don't have. Well, I was going to say we certainly don't have the kind of crypto war that there was in the 90s, but maybe we do sometimes, like we did recently with FinCEN.
Right. Yeah. And I want to dig more into the recent FinCEN regulation that you guys, played a huge part in delaying, at least from my understanding. But before we get to that, want to talk a bit more about like how government has treated, specifically, like I guess the U.S. government, but even just globally, crypto thus far. I know, like, I really enjoy talking with people in the crypto space in general, but specifically you like crypto OGs, as I kind of call you, like
Mm-hmm.
you and Roger and Eric Voorhees and a number of you guys who have been following everything since 2011, 2010, even 2013 is like very early from my perspective. And I think there's maybe like a few generations people can kind of separate out. But all the earliest people talk about how they're kind of surprised at how little the government has kind of reacted to all of this, that the regulations thus far have been fairly friendly and somewhat reasonable and just more hands off than they would have expected to this technology that they can kind of see, or that they could kind of see from the early days before Bitcoin was even a very valuable thing, that just the potential of the technology could one day enable people to um, kind of operate outside of the control of governments, where fiat currency loses a lot of its importance, and there's options for people to kind of exit that game and participate in this decentralized currency, and store their value that way, and exchange value that way. uh, it sounded like you've been somewhat surprised as well, but would love to have some clarity on like what you kind of expected to happen from the early days and how that's unfolded, and why you think, maybe things haven't been quite as hard-handed as you might have expected.
Yeah. No, actually, I don't think I was surprised. I think I've been, I guess it's funny. It's like I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a different reaction, but I really have been surprised by the reaction we've had. Um, and I've been saying that to crypto folks for some time. And the reason is that, look, the government is made up of people. I think people think of the government as like this massive kind of Goliath that that acts with one mind and can see, can act on long-term interests, et cetera. But it's not. The government is made up of lots of people with conflicting interests, conflicting missions, and like so many other parts of our economy and society, with sort of incentives that are short term. And so what ends up happening is, um, regulators, policymakers, they have a job to do, whether, let's say, that's law enforcement or um, consumer protection, right? They have a job to do and they have limited resources. And so they focus on getting the job done right now that, that they have before them and meeting the challenges that they have before them right now. And so, sure, maybe you could speculate that cryptocurrency, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, are going to have really wide-ranging societal impacts, and impacts for government long term. But that's usually not going to be the basis for policymaking. The basis for policymaking is what's happening on the ground right now, right? Are people getting scammed by ICOs? We're going to have to deal with ICOs. Are drug markets being set up online? People are using them. We're going to have to deal with that, right? And so, given that that's what they're doing, all we've ever sought, as FinCEN, all I've ever sought is no worse treatment than, or no different treatment, for cryptocurrencies and people using them than there is for people using cash in the legacy financial system. And that is a fair thing to ask. And quite frankly, it's pretty much all policymakers want to, right? And so, given that that's where we are, I'm kind of not surprised that that's how far, we've gotten.
Right. So, going outside of the regulatory issues a little bit and talking more broadly about governments and, the potential that they could be willing to or able to kind of take down Bitcoin in its entirety or take down crypto, or at least do significant damage to the market that crypto is creating in its entirety. That's been one of, more and more, it seems that Bitcoin, or the destiny of something like Bitcoin is sort of becoming more truly inevitable, as a lot of people talk about how it is. But I try to take like a very conservative view and think about like, okay, what could possibly go wrong? It's an unprecedented technology. It seems that its demise, if there were to be one, would be somewhat unprecedented as well. And I can't help but think about, the potential of governments to really attack it and try to compromise Bitcoin and its decentralized nature and everything like that. And I know it's obviously become much more challenging, much more expensive in terms of how much something like that might cost, if at all possible. And then separately, more costly in terms of like social capital as well, with all of these corporations and institutions now invested.
Mhm.
If the US government, for example, were to try to compromise Bitcoin, they would be really upsetting a very large number of people who's they want to keep on their good side. So I'm curious, you talked, I had listened to you talk on a podcast in, I think, 2014 with Vice about how Bitcoin had historically been, shown extreme resilience. And there are certainly ways that it could probably fail. But, thus far, it obviously hadn't. And you were fairly confident in the future. So now, 7 years later, it's worth, 40 times more in terms of its market cap. Um, and it's just the lasting power, having been around for 11 years instead of 4, is pretty significant. The longer it stays, the longer it seems poised to stay. So I guess my question is, do you still view vulnerabilities in Bitcoin's ability to be compromised? Like, is it did it go from a 10% chance to a 1% chance or something like that? And then secondarily, do you think that there is kind of a point of no return where there's too many people, like institutions and corporations, say a lot of companies follow kind of Elon Musk and Michael Saylor and Jack Dorsey's lead and put a portion of their balance sheet in Bitcoin? At what point is it kind of irreversible that these governments could do something like that?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two, um, like I would separate two things. On the one hand, you have technically, can Bitcoin be stopped? And I don't think it can be, right? It's kind of an unstoppable machine, um, uh, like quite literally, right? So even if tomorrow Congress were to pass a law banning Bitcoin, that would not kill Bitcoin. People would continue to run it, and people would continue to use it within and without the United States. So I think Bitcoin is resilient that way, and will continue to be. But that's separate from I don't think Bitcoin can kill or compromise Bitcoin, as you say, in that way, and I don't think it would even try, right? Because I think government would know that uh, it really would not be a successful strategy, depending on what it wanted to accomplish. I think the real danger is that Bitcoin's social impact or economic impact could be diminished by certain government actions, right? And I think that certainly is possible. And I think you're right that it's probably less likely today than it was last year and the year before that and the year before that, right? And the more um, people use it and care about it, and especially the more people of higher relative status to government use it and care about it, the more difficult it becomes for government to do something about it. But yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of things the government could do, from anti-money laundering policy, from consumer protection policy, from tax policy, that could be, policies that are more onerous than the ones we currently have, that would just make it, um, less attractive for people to use. And that, I think, is the real vector for attack, if there is one. But I hope what policymakers understand is that while Bitcoin and cryptocurrency presents a challenge to certain things that they've traditionally done a certain way, right? And they're going to have to update the laws or rethink what and how they do what things they do and how they do them. They're operating in a global environment where, at least certainly for the U.S. has always succeeded when there is an open environment, right? So the internet is a good example of that, right? Other countries in the world were trying to either suppress the internet or were trying to develop their own national internets, right? Whereas the US bet on having a completely open, permissionless, unowned internet, and allowed entrepreneurs to build whatever they wanted on it. Now, that came with all kinds of challenges to the existing power structure, right? So law enforcement had to deal with criminals who now could communicate easily and in encrypted ways. You had all kinds of copyright violations that could now happen that weren't possible before. You had all kinds of maybe illegal to gray area things like pornography and gambling that were now super widespread. So the internet brought all these things, but it also brought again this permissionless space that entrepreneurs could go crazy with. And who was able to sort of benefit and dominate that space? Well, it was the United States, which has a culture that is perfectly suited to thrive in that environment, right? A culture of openness and liberalism, right? Whereas, France during that same period was building Minitel, right? If you're familiar with Minitel, it was like the French national network, and it was created top down by the phone company, and everybody in France had a Minitel terminal in their home, right? And it just went nowhere. Think about it, right? It's like it's completely top down. So I hope that, and I think that policymakers get it, that while crypto brings challenges, when they look around the world and they see China developing its own financial and internet networks, what's going to be the best way to compete with that? Is it to build our own centralized systems and try to go head to head, or to allow completely open, permissionless networks be the standard and allow American ingenuity to run up? So anyhow, it's kind of a long-winded way to say that I think you're right. So the longer it runs and the bigger it gets and the more people use and care about it, the more difficult it becomes for government to do things that would damage it. But I also think that there's another reason, which is simply that it's in the best interest of an open liberal society like the United States or the UK or others to back open networks like Bitcoin relative to closed networks like the kind we're seeing in China.
Do you spend a lot of time thinking about like, the regulations in other countries and the policies in other countries? Like you talk about China, and I don't know if this is a fair comparison at all, but it sounds like that's almost like the Mitel of France versus the internet. Is that at all an apt comparison? And if so, it sounds like you're reasonably optimistic that the US will continue to go kind of the open route, which obviously worked. Now we have all of the best, not all of them maybe, but a lot of the best internet companies came out of the US. And if they took a similar approach, maybe all of the best cryptocurrencies and crypto companies could come out of the US. Do you pay attention to China as well, and then other countries in between that might be smaller, but by kind of introducing very friendly crypto policies could actually become leaders in a different way in the decades to come?
Yeah, I don't spend as much time as I'd want, just because we're so focused on the United States, because that's where our expertise is and what our focus is. But I try to keep abreast, and certainly China, I pay attention to, just because I know that that's very important to policymakers, and there's a clear competitive environment that's developing. And yeah, I think China is a little different than just a straight up Minitel example, because I think China has learned that lesson, right? They've been observing, and in fact, a lot of China's current success stems from it adopting a lot of the features of open liberal societies and markets, um, uh, without adopting all of them. That said, I think that what China is building is ultimately centralized, right? If you look at its um, digital currency initiative, it's ultimately centralized. It's ultimately controlled. It ultimately has brakes on anonymity, um, and I don't think uh, the jury is out on what path the U.S. will take. I'm very hopeful, and I think it should be just within the nature of the United States to reject that kind of path and pursue just the playbook that worked so well for us once before with the internet, and follow that path. Um, but the jury's not out, right? We might be seduced by that that kind of FOMO, basically seeing China's success and thinking, well, maybe we should emulate them. Hopefully, we don't do that, and hopefully, we say no. Uh, we do well in a Wild West, right? Um, Regulators don't like uh, Wild Wests, or the idea of Wild West, but relative to other countries, certainly relative to top-down systems like China's, the U.S. is going to thrive in a Wild West, and that's the kind of environment that we should um, encourage globally. Even if we create certain guardrails to protect consumers, et cetera, you want to have an open space like the internet.
Right. And so it's one thing to look kind of country to country at the differences in approach, but there's also some differences within the US, state to state. I know Wyoming is kind of regarded as having the best, most friendliest crypto policies. I had the mayor of Miami on the show as well, and he's trying to bring something similar to Miami, if not broader Florida, I suppose. What do when you think of like state to state opportunities for someone like Wyoming to, bring a lot of innovation into their state, which like Wyoming maybe isn't the first, state that comes to mind in terms of like where tech companies are born, but that could be changing if crypto is a large part of, the next generation of great companies or great entrepreneurs. And Wyoming is kind of the first and greatest place to go to do that. So I guess, what is Wyoming doing that makes it so friendly versus some of these other states? And what do you view as kind of being in the state's powers generally to be able to distinguish themselves within the confines of US kind of federal regulations? And maybe, is Wyoming kind of already at the bleeding edge of what a state can do? Or is there even more that certain states could kind of adopt to be really friendly to crypto?
Yeah. So I think in the U.S. we have a federalist system, which is great for lots of reasons. But it means that certain things are regulated state by state rather than to one national level. And among those things are things like consumer protection and investor protection. And so really what Wyoming, the first thing the states have to do is look at the law that affects cryptocurrency that they have sole jurisdiction over, and make sure um, that it makes sense, that it's reasonable, that it's rational, and that it addresses the right risks, right? And so um, the main thing there is um, money transmission licensing, right? So if you are a firm that is in the business of holding people's crypto for whatever reason, typically because you're an exchange or you're a wallet service, if you are, holding custody of somebody's crypto, you're going to have to get licensed, and that's true in I think every state and territory but one. And so, as a state, really, what you need to do is make sure that the criteria for who can get a license and how is very straightforward, is rational, and is easy to get for people who are seriously in business, right? And I think most states have done that. I think some states like New York, with its bit license, have gone kind of in the opposite way, where they've made it incredibly difficult and not very clear or rational about who has to get a license. But I think most other states have gotten it right. And Wyoming certainly did that. I think Wyoming goes one step further in basically creating not just a good environment as to the law that they have exclusive jurisdiction over, but creating an environment that helps it compete with the federal government. And what I mean by that is, in the U.S., banks can either be chartered by the federal government or by state governments, right? And so what Wyoming has done is create basically a state chartered bank license, right, or state banking charter that's available to crypto firms, and that allows them to become a full bank with access to the payment system, et cetera. So that's fantastic, and I think Wyoming is the only state that's done that to date. I know that other states, are now sort of following that lead, considering doing the same. I think again the jury's not out on that either, because while Wyoming may issue you a bank charter, you still have to be accepted by the Fed and the FDIC. And I don't think that any Wyoming bank that has gone through that complete process yet. I think like Kraken, for example, is going through that now. But the good news is that at the federal level, the OCC, which is the federal banking regulator, has also begun to charter essentially crypto banks, who are also going to have to go through that process. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think Wyoming is probably the leader at this point. I hope other states, follow its suit. Um, and I think if there are other things that states could do, one thing I think a lot about, that I don't think states, that I think more could be done by states is related to mining. I think that there are states who could basically make it more clear to crypto miners that they have local energy sources that are available, and just create the right environment that way. So I'm thinking of Wyoming maybe, but the Dakotas, Oklahoma, Texas. These are all states that potentially could benefit from having miners come to their jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's an interesting addition, and definitely like that's kind of exactly what I was hoping to hear, was kind of an idea for states to even push a little bit further. And the further each state's push, and maybe others start copying them, maybe the federal government, and I don't know if this is how you think about it at all, like federal probably does the majority of leading, but if they see that a lot of states are trying to be at the
Yep.
cutting edge, maybe it influences that way as well. Um, Now I do want to touch on the recent issue that I think was like the biggest thing to pop its head up, which was the FinCEN ruling. I think you guys have referred to it as like midnight rulemaking, which was a new term to me, but basically, as I understand it, when like an outgoing administration is coming up on its time, they like to try to kind of push last minute regulations just to kind of leave their impact and get things through and whatnot. And so one of these things was this new proposed rule from FinCEN that my understanding was kind of took an unfair approach at revealing personal information and personal identity information related to crypto money transfers. Like you said before, like you just kind of want it to be on par with legacy systems, and this maybe was further than that. Can you kind of give an overview of what happened there? And I understand Coin Center had some success in kind of influencing how things have played out thus far. So if you could kind of talk about how you were able to do that as well, and maybe more broadly the role that Coin Center has played historically, since you founded it and started it and have served as executive director, and then also kind of how it'll continue to in the future.
Okay, it's a lot there, and this is it's a very long story, so I'll try to condense it as much as I can. But basically, a lot of what happened here with FinCEN stems from the fact that this was a sort of personal interest of the Secretary Mnuchin at the time, and we actually began to see sort of the beginnings of what this rule would become, actually in February of 2020, maybe even January, late January of 2020, when Secretary Mnuchin in testimony before I think it was the House, said basically that self-hosted wallets were basically the equivalent of numbered Swiss bank accounts, and that we couldn't just allow people to have a lot of money without a record, et cetera, and that pretty soon FinCEN would be doing something about self-hosted wallets, which came as a big surprise to me. It was kind of came out of left field, and I think it kind of surprised the folks at FinCEN as well, that he said that. And shortly thereafter, we and a bunch of others in the sort of financial industry that works on crypto met with the secretary and his staff, and had a conversation about the issue of self-hosted wallets, and explained, try to clarify a lot of misconceptions about self-hosted wallets, try to explain how law enforcement depends on the interplay between custodied crypto and self-hosted wallets, et cetera. And at that point, we were pretty, it seemed to us that the secretary and the staff were pretty satisfied with the answers that were given. And also at that, immediately after that, the pandemic hit. And so clearly the secretary's attention and priorities went elsewhere. And that issue kind of went away. That concern about self-hosted wallets, as far as we were concerned, we thought had been addressed. But then, lo and behold, coming up on the fall, right as it was clear that the administration was probably going to be wrapping up, and that there was very little time to do anything if they wanted to get anything done, it sort of became clear that the secretary wanted to do something about self-hosted wallets. It sort of came right back. And you can kind of see this from the language in the proposed rule. Basically, so typically when an agency creates a rule with new regulations, what it has to do by law is give notice to the public of the proposed rule by publishing in a Federal Register the proposed rule, and then give time for the public to comment on the rule. And typically, an agency will give 60 days. Right, that's kind of like the standard for the public to comment, and then after the public has commented, it has to consider all the comments and it has to address all the comments when it issues a final rule. And the problem is that 60 days was, or the problem for the secretary was that 60 days was beyond the time that he would be in office, right? So there was no way he was going to be able to get a rule done in that time. And so you can see from the language of the rule that that rule was actually meant to be issued as what's called an interim final rule. And an interim final rule, and this is why I say this is a very long story, I'm trying to keep it brief, but an interim final rule is one where there's basically an emergency of some kind, or there's some situation in which basically the rule that is being announced would be undermined by the notice and public comment taking. And so what agencies are allowed to do by law in those circumstances is to issue an interim final rule, which means that they publish a rule in the Federal Register that is effective immediately, having never taken comment or previously said anything about it. They just publish a rule, it's effective immediately. And there is then a comment period that begins. And at the end of that comment period, the agency, if it chooses to, based on those comments, it can amend the rule. And that would have been a disaster, right? Because this rule basically does, or would do two things. It would create a cash transaction report requirement for cryptocurrency, which basically means that whenever you deposit or withdraw $10,000 or more worth of crypto from a regulated financial institution like Coinbase or Kraken, that the company has to automatically report that fact. So that's one requirement. And the other requirement would have been basically a counterparty identification rule, which would require the company to also know not just your name, because you're their customer, so they have to know their customer, to not just know you, which is already the law, but to also know who your payee is, basically know their customer's customer, right? And that goes beyond any requirement that exists today for any kind of financial institution. And it would have been a disaster for basically financial institutions today that deal with self-hosted wallets. So the issue for us in the fall of last year was trying to make sure that this would not become an interim final rule, because then it would just become the rule immediately without any opportunity for the public to weigh in. And we basically, we and others basically reached out to the secretary, reached out to FinCEN, made the case for why there's no rush here. And clearly what was happening here is there was no good public policy reason. No, there was no emergency. There was no reason why this had to be rushed through and it had to be interim final. The only reason, clearly, was that the secretary was leaving and he wanted to get this done before he left. And we also, I think benefited from our friends in law enforcement also not seeing the need for the rush here. And so I think the secretary internally got a lot of pushback from law enforcement community, intelligence community, being like, what are you doing? Like, this industry has been very cooperative to date. We're not dying for this information. There's actually not clear that we need this information. What's the rush? And so it's pretty clear that he relented and did a more traditional notice and comment rulemaking, where notice is given and comment is sought from the public before the rule is made final. But again, still trying to finish this rule before he left, they gave an incredibly short time period, right? So they gave like 15 days. And they announced a rule like the Friday afternoon before Christmas week. It was just a total insult, totally unreasonable. And I won't bore you, but long story short, we did several things. Number one, we worked to get a campaign to get the public to comment, right? Get the crypto community to comment. And we worked with Fight for the Future to develop a website that allowed people to easily do that. We created a form that allowed people to email the secretary directly and say, we need more time. And at the end of the day, we had 7,000 comments were filed in this rulemaking. And that's more comments that FinCEN has received in any rule combined over the past decade, I think. So that's one thing. We also worked with firms in the space that would be directly affected with this to file really substantive comments related to this. And working with the Blockchain Association, we made it clear that if this rule were to become final before the end of the Trump administration in that sort of rushed period, that this rule would be challenged in court, that immediately we would file suit, right? The Blockchain Association and others would have filed basically procedural challenges that I think were very strong if he did that immediately. And if that wasn't successful, which I think it would have been, but if that wasn't successful, then CoinCenter would file a suit under bringing constitutional challenges. So all of that pressure, I think, helped make the secretary relent, and he extended the comment period into it basically extended it so that it would go into the Biden administration. And that was always our goal, was to try to get that extended, because we knew that really the driving force behind this rule, and especially the more extreme parts of it, was the secretary himself. And we were fairly certain that once he is out of the picture, you would get probably a more reasonable hearing about what's actually needed, right? And sure enough, what we've seen now is, now that you have the Biden administration, FinCEN has issued an extension where now there is an additional 60 days, so now we're into more normal rulemaking. And it's our expectation that at the end of this period, when there's a final rule, that it's not going to have the most extreme parts of the rule that, again, were driven by him. Now, we're not certain of that. Something could change, but that's kind of my expectation right now.
Great. That's a super helpful overview, and appreciate you taking a long story and making it reasonable to understand in plain English and everything like that. Sounds like you had quite a busy Christmas, but it was definitely worthwhile, it sounds like. And the fact that you had several thousand comments, maybe outnumbering all from the past decade for FinCEN is a very interesting statistic. I think it speaks to on the one hand, your guys' success and ability in doing what you're doing, but also just the passion of people who are in this crypto ecosystem. And it's interesting because it's obviously a passionate group, and increasingly quite a wealthy group as well, and maybe even more so in the future. I know you guys raised recently. I saw that there was a donation match by Grayscale of up to $1 million, which you guys succeeded to raise. So congratulations on that. And then I also saw that Jack Dorsey came in with another $1 million. So sounds awesome for you guys. And I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that maybe the success with all this FinCEN stuff might have contributed towards people recognizing you guys and the importance of what you're doing and going and putting their money behind it. What is that going to enable Coin Center to do in kind of the years to come? What are some of the obviously I guess a large part of what you do is kind of keeping an eye out for damaging regulations and sort of defending against them, but do you have any idea of what the next few years might look like for Coin Center?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are definitely overwhelmed by the support from the public for Coin Center. We've always had great support from the community, but this past year, I think, especially starting with the Stable Act and our work against that, and then certainly after what happened with FinCEN, I think people finally really clicked for them what Coin Center was, what the point of us is and what it is that we do, which I think before maybe wasn't clear. And this year, more than the amounts of money that we've raised, which is fantastic. But more than that, what really overwhelms us is the number of donors, the number of people who have stepped up, especially in just individual small donations. Basically, it's orders of magnitude more than we've ever had any year before. So that's fantastic, and we're incredibly grateful. As far as what the funding allows us to do going forward, number one, it allows us to be a permanent force. Not that we weren't going to be before, but we were always having to worry about fundraising to make sure we were going to be here the next year. This is great that this sort of sends a signal that we're here for the long term. It also creates for us kind of a what's the word? Basically a defense fund, where in the future, so think about the FinCEN rule, right? If the FinCEN rule had come out the other way, and by the way, it might still, right? This rule is not final yet. It's not my expectation that it's going to be as bad as we thought it was going to be. But if it had been, or if it is, we're going to have to challenge that in court. And we're going to have to take that all the way to Supreme Court. And that costs a lot of money. So that's the kind of thing that we're now well prepared to take on if we have to. And additionally, some of the most pressing work that we have is related to example for things like tax, right? So the law around anti-money laundering, put aside this particular rule, which we think now has been addressed, but the law around anti-money laundering, around securities regulation, around consumer protection, we think it's all pretty good. The law around tax is abysmal. And we want to do more in that space, but that requires really specialized knowledge, right? I'm not a tax attorney. And so that's the kind of thing that, requires probably a bigger investment than we've been able to make to date. So anyhow, those are some of the things that we're hoping to do now.
Yeah, that all sounds great and makes a lot of sense. Congratulations again on that. I want to thank you, Jerry, for taking the time to come on. It's been an awesome conversation, and I've really learned a lot about the regulation and framework around all of that, both internationally and within the states. And regulation isn't like the first thing that I tend to gravitate towards, but it's super important to understand all of this, especially in crypto, where it can kind of make and break a lot of things. So, we talked about the donations you guys have been able to raise, but, maybe in closing, it would be great if you could tell people listening how they can go and support as well. And, where they can follow you and Coin Center on progress, in the future.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, if folks want to support us, we'd love to have you. You go to coincenter.org, and you should check out basically everything we write. We make available publicly, and you can find on our website. I think at the top right there's a donate button. Click on that, and there will be instructions, and you could donate in crypto or in with your credit card, and we appreciate it. As far as following us, I'm at Jerry Brito on Twitter and at CoinCenter. You might also follow my colleague Niraj Agrawal, who is our spokesperson, and he's very active on Twitter. So yeah, that's how you find us.